Hey students, I'm Dr. Sakshi Arora Hans, your Obs and Gynae faculty. Today I am here to discuss with you the INI CET 2020 recall questions of Obs and Gynae. Now, before I start discussing those questions, congratulations to all of you who've done so well in this exam. It's wonderful to see that 8 out of the top 10 rankers are Marrow Pro users. Bachcho, you have done us proud. Congratulations once again. But all those who couldn't do well in this exam, don't get disappointed. You still have another chance. Rather, I would say that you have 2 more chances. You have NEET PG exam and you have the INI CET mid-year exams to live your dreams. I know the announcement has come that the NEET PG exam has been postponed. And this has brought a mixed set of reactions from all of you. Some of you are excited that okay, and rather you are relieved that okay, the exam has been postponed. And some of you are disappointed with this news. You don't know what to do. Now your preparation was almost towards the end and suddenly this news coming has brought down your tempo. Yes. This is happening with many students and I am getting on my Telegram group, on the Instagram handle that ma'am, how to deal with this? What to do in these 2 to 3 months now? So I'm going to talk about all this towards the end of the discussion. But before that, let's first get going with the questions of INI CET Obs and Gynae. See, this year it was a little unusual. Normally in your AIIMS exam or any central institute exam, the number of questions which were given to Obs and Gynae, they were roughly 20-25 questions used to come from Obs and Gynae. This year, the number of questions which have come in the INI CET exam, they are 10 odd questions. But that doesn't mean that for the NEET exam or for the next mid-year INI CET exams, you are not going to focus on Obs and Gynae. Obs and Gynae is an important clinical subject and you cannot afford to neglect it. Clear? So let's get going with the questions. Question 1 was, a nursing assistant posted in obstetric care was asked to plot a partograph to monitor the progress of labor. After how much dilatation of the cervix must she start plotting the graph? So if you remember, I have been telling this to you in the revision classes as well, that always partogram has to be started from 4 centimeters. The partogram which we are using these days is the WHO's modified partogram. And WHO's modified partogram, it begins at 4 centimeters. Because according to WHO, till date, the active phase begins at 4 centimeters. So in WHO's modified partogram, the latent phase is absent and active phase is only plotted. And since according to WHO, the active phase begins at 4 centimeters, that is why we start plotting a partogram from 4 centimeters dilatation of the cervix, right? Now, if they ask you that as per ACOG, what is the latent phase and what is the active phase? So as per ACOG, latent phase is when true labor pains begin and up till 5 centimeters dilatation of the cervix. And as per ACOG, the active phase begins at more than equal to 6 centimeters. So whether it's your clinical questions or whether it is your clinical practice or whether it is ACOG guidelines, everywhere we follow this, that the active phase begins at 6 centimeters. It is only if in your questions you are getting words like WHO or you are getting words like partogram, then you are going to say that active phase begins at more than equal to 4 centimeters and the latent phases from true labor pains and up till 3 centimeters. These are the only places where you are going to answer it as 4 centimeters. Rest, as of now, we say that yes, the latent active phase is from 6 centimeters onwards. That's the latest what we follow. right? Now, in the modified WHO partogram, I told you that there is no latent phase and the plotting begins at 4 centimeters. So that means when you are going to plot the first marking, that first marking is done on alert line itself. Please remember, the first marking which you are going to make on the modified partogram, the partogram which we are using these days, the first marking is on the alert line. Right? And as per WHO, the active phase is beginning from 4 centimeters, right? These are the two things which you have to remember. The third thing which you have to remember is that as per WHO, the minimum dilatation which is needed in active phase is 1 centimeters per hour. So the minimum rate of dilatation in active phase is 1 centimeter per hour. This is another very important thing which you have to remember. So this over here, I have an image of the modified WHO's partogram for you. Here you can see that the markings are going to begin from 4 centimeters. From 4 centimeters going up till 10 centimeters, we draw the alert line in which the dilatation should happen at 1 centimeter per hour, right? So we are going to draw an alert line beginning from 4 centimeters. And suppose my patient, whenever she comes to me and she's 4 centimeters dilated. So whenever I start plotting the graph, I am going to plot it on the alert line. Suppose patient comes to me and she is 5 centimeters dilated. So on the y-axis, I'm going to see 5 centimeters, and on the alert line itself, I'm going to make the first marking. Is that clear to all of you? And then I'm going to see whether the next plotting which I'm going to make, whether it is coming to the left of alert line. Now, if your plotting remains to the left of alert line, that is in zone 1, which I have written there, that means the progress of your patient is normal. If the plotting comes in zone 2, that means now you should get alerted, right? Now, 4 hours away from the alert line, the action line is drawn, right? Now, suppose the progress of your patient is lying towards the right of action line, that is in zone 3, which I have made there. That means now you have to take an action, right? So if it is lying in zone 1, which is towards the left of alert line, that means the progress is normal. If it is lying in zone 2, that is towards the right of alert line, that means now the obstetrician should get alerted. And if you are at a primary center, this is the time when the patient should be transferred to a higher or a tertiary care center, right? And if it is towards the right of action line, that means that now you have to take some action depending on the diagnosis what you make, right? The next important thing which I want you to note in this partogram over here is this box, right? So if I ask you, each box on a partogram, how many hours does it represent? So each box or each square on a partogram, it represents 1 hour, right? So each big square over here is representing 1 hour. Is that clear to all of you? Okay. Now this is WHO's simplified partogram. Just have a look at it also. Here the words are not mentioned that what is the action line and what is the alert line, but you can make out. This line over here will be alert line and this line over here would be action line. In this image again you can see that they have depicted only the active phase, and active phase is beginning from 4 centimeters. So plotting has to begin from 4 centimeters onwards. Here the green zone which is represented here is the zone 1 which I showed you in the previous partogram where I had made 1. So green means that everything is normal. The progress of your patient is normal. Yellow zone means that now you have to get alerted, and the red zone means that now you have to take some action. So this is WHO's simplified partogram. Clear to all of you? So that was a pretty easy question. Next question. Identify the fetal position. Now this question we have already discussed it in the rapid revision module. Now for all such questions where you have to identify, so actually it's not the fetal presentation, it's the fetal position which you need to identify. The options tell you that it is the fetal position. Now, whenever you have to identify the fetal position, you have to look at the occiput. that where is the occiput of the baby facing. Now, if the occiput of the baby, it is towards the pubic symphysis, that means you are dealing with anterior positions. If occiput is towards the sacral promontory, that means you are dealing with posterior positions, right? So in this image, I can see that the occiput is facing to anteriorly, right? So I can see the occiput is anterior. So that means I am dealing with anterior position. So either it has to be a right occipito-anterior position or it has to be a left occipito-anterior position. How are you going to identify that? So whatever direction is the occiput facing towards you, it will be opposite in the mother, right? So in this image, you can see the occiput is facing towards your left hand, right? Now, if the occiput is facing towards your left hand, in the mother, it will be the right hand. So this will become right occipito-anterior position, right? So it's the opposite. That is what you have to remember. If in the image occiput is towards your left hand, it's mother's right hand. If in the image it is towards your right hand, it's mother's left hand. Clear to all of you? Now, it's very easy to identify positions if it is given like this. But maybe in the NEET exam or in the upcoming INI CET mid-year exam, they twist this question a little. They do not give you this image. They give you images like these. And they ask you to identify the position of the fetus. Now, tell me how you're going to identify. Now, you are going to identify it based on the findings that we all know that anterior fontanelle is diamond shaped. Yes. And it's the posterior fontanelle which is triangular. And we know that it is the posterior fontanelle which lies towards the occipital bone. So this means that when I get an image like this, I am going to look at where is the posterior fontanelle lying. If posterior fontanelle is facing anteriorly, so I am dealing with anterior positions. If posterior fontanelle is facing posteriorly, I am dealing with posterior positions. And then, yes, the left and right remain the same way. That if the posterior fontanelle is towards your left hand side, then it means it is mother's right and vice versa. Clear to all of you? So let's look at image A and image B. So first let's have a look at image A. Now in image A, tell me where is the triangular looking fontanelle facing? The triangular looking fontanelle is facing towards the sacral promontory. That means we are dealing with the posterior positions. Right? Now tell me what is the direction of the posterior fontanelle? It is towards your left hand side. So because it is towards your left hand side, it will be right occipito posterior position. So it will be right occipito posterior position. Clear to all of you? Look at image B. Now in image B, where is the occiput facing? Occiput is facing towards the pubic symphysis. So I am dealing with occipito anterior position, right? And what is the direction of the posterior fontanelle? The direction of the posterior fontanelle is towards my right hand side. It is towards your right hand side. So in the mother, it will be the left hand side. So it is left occipito anterior position. Clear to all of you? This is how you are going to identify positions. Now tell me, what is the most common position during labor? So the most common position in labor is LOT position, right? Which is the most common anterior position? Most common anterior position is left occipito anterior position. Most common at the time of labor is left occipito transverse. Most common anterior position is left occipito anterior. And the most common posterior position is right occipito posterior position. These are few other questions which they can ask you on position. Clear? Next question. Next question is identify the grip. Now again, this is one of those questions which we have already done in the videos and in the revision module as well. So all of you know that over here you can see the hands are towards the lateral side of the mother's abdomen. So if they are towards the lateral side of the mother's abdomen, it has to be a lateral grip, right? So let's quickly see all the 4 grips, the Leopold's 4 maneuvers. Leopold's 4 maneuvers, the first, the second, third and fourth. So in the first maneuver, the first thing what we do is we palpate the fundal area of the uterus, right? And because you are palpating the fundal area of the uterus, the first maneuver is also called as the fundal grip, right? Now, in the fundal grip, what am I going to look at? In the fundal grip, I am going to see what pole of the fetus am I finding, right? What can be palpated, whether I am palpating the buttocks or whether am I palpating the head, right? So this will tell me what is the lie and what is the presentation. How are you going to know the lie of the baby? See, if the fundal grip is empty, right, that means the baby is in transverse lie. So I can come to know what is the lie. If there is something palpated in the fundal grip, that means it's a longitudinal lie. Now I want to know whether it is cephalic presentation or whether it is breech presentation. So if I am getting firm, large, nodular mass, right, that means I'm palpating the buttocks. So if you are getting firm, large, nodular mass, that means you are palpating the buttocks. That means it is cephalic presentation. On the other hand, if you are feeling, very hard, round, ballotable mass, right, a more mobile mass, then that means you are feeling the head of the baby, and that means if head is towards the fundal area, the buttocks are towards the lower side, that means it is breech presentation, right? So fundal grip tells you about the lie and about the presentation. Now when you are doing the first, second and the third maneuver, you are facing towards the face of the patient, right? While you are doing the fourth maneuver, you are facing towards the feet of the patient. In either cases, in all of the cases, you are going to stand on the right hand side while doing the examination, and you are going to make sure that the bladder of the patient is empty, right? Now, from the fundus, you are going to move your hands towards the lateral side of the mother's abdomen. And when you are palpating the lateral side of the mother's abdomen, that is what is called as the second maneuver, and that is also called as the lateral grip, right? Now, in the lateral grip, there are only 2 things which can be felt. Either you can feel the back of the baby or you can feel the limbs of the baby. The back of the baby, it is going to give you a feeling of board-like rigidity. Whereas limbs, they will be, you will get multiple knob-like structures which will be felt. So multiple knob-like structures would be felt. Then you come to know that that's the limb. If you are feeling a board-like rigidity, you come to know that's the back. Now, wherever is the back of the baby, that tells you what position the baby is in. If the back is towards the left side, that means I am dealing with left positions, that is the LOT or the LOA or the LOP. And if the back is towards the right side, I come to know whether it is ROT, ROA or ROP. Right? Now, from the sides, I am going to move my hand and I'm going to bring it up till the pubic symphysis, and I'm going to do the third maneuver, which is called as the Pollick grip. Pollick grip. Now, Pollick grip, it is done with a single hand, right? So in Pollick grip, you are going to do Pollick grip with a single hand, and you're going to place your hand above the pubic symphysis, and again you are going to see what you are feeling, whether you are feeling the buttocks or whether you are feeling the head. Now, if you are feeling, in most of the cases would be cephalic presentation, and you are going to feel a very hard, firm structure, right? Now, if this hard, firm, rounded structure, if it is ballotable, that means engagement has not occurred. If it is not ballotable, that means engagement has occurred, right? Now, after that, you are going to face towards the feet of the patient, and using your 2 hands, you are going to reconfirm the findings which you found in the Pollick grip. And that is your 4th maneuver, which is called as the deep pelvic grip. So the deep pelvic grip, you are going to confirm the findings of the Pollick grip, right? In Pollick grip, you will come to know the presentation and you are also going to know whether engagement has occurred or not, right? So these are Leopold's all four maneuvers, right? Let's go to the next question. The next question was, they had given you an image where they had shown you that there were some skin cells, keratinocytes, then they had shown some dendritic cells, Langhans cells, then they had shown, chorionic villi, and they had shown you, some receptors. Now, after this image, they had given you which virus has the following pathophysiology and it causes microcephaly in the fetus. Now, when you look at that image, although that image, I agree, was not very clear and you were not able to enlarge or zoom the image and see it clearly, but still the small hints which were given there, they pointed towards only one pathology, and that is the Zika virus. Presence of Hofbauer cells in the image, presence of Langhans cells in the image, and presence of receptors along with microcephaly. They were enough for you to make a diagnosis of Zika virus, right? Now, these days, it is the COVID-19 pandemic which is going on. In 2015-16, we dealt with the epidemic of Zika virus. So, epidemic of Zika virus, that was, it started in Brazil and all over the newspapers. We had news like so many pregnant females who got affected during that time. They gave birth to microcephalic fetuses, right? And this Zika virus, so let's talk a little bit more about the Zika virus. So this Zika virus, it is an RNA virus which belongs to the flavivirus family, and it is spread by the bite of the Aedes mosquito, right? And Aedes mosquito, it spreads dengue as well, and it's a morning mosquito. Now, what happens is that when this Zika virus, it is spread when the Aedes mosquito bites any human being, and this deposits this Zika virus. This Zika virus, it has got a special affinity for special kind of receptors, and these receptors are the TAM-AXL receptors and TIM1 receptors, right? Now, I won't say that TIM1 receptor is very specific for Zika virus. TIM1 receptor is, all the flaviviruses, rather most of the flaviviruses, they have got affinity for TIM1 receptors, including the Ebola virus, right? So this Zika virus, it has got affinity for this TAM-AXL receptor and the TIM1 receptor. And then because of these receptors, they are present on the skin cells. So it attaches itself to the epidermal keratocytes and to the dermal fibroblast. And from there, it spreads to the dendritic cells, right? Now, till here, it's good. You have understood. Now, the problem arises that when this mosquito bites a pregnant female, then this Zika virus has the ability to infect or attach itself to the Hofbauer cells. And that is how vertical transmission occurs. So, Aedes mosquito, or you can say, sorry, not the Aedes mosquito, the Zika virus is one of the first recognized teratogen, which is mosquito-borne, right? Now, when a pregnant female is affected by this Zika virus, she will have all the normal symptoms which a patient of any flu would be having. She would be having conjunctivitis, she would be having rash, then malaise, fever, headache, and joint pain. These are the normal symptoms which you get with Zika virus. Apart from this virus, it has got affinity for central nervous system, right? So, you also get neurological symptoms in pregnant females. You may get, I'm not saying every female who's infected with Zika virus will have neurological symptoms, but you may get neurological symptoms like there may be Guillain-Barré syndrome or myelitis, right? Now, once vertical transmission happens and this virus, it reaches the Hofbauer cells, and it then from the Hofbauer cells, it reaches the, the fetus. It leads to neurological complications in the fetus also. So there it brings about brain atrophy. Cortical matter of the brain, it gets atrophied, right? And that is how it leads to microcephaly. So at this time, during 2015-2016, many pregnant females, around 1,000 pregnant females, they gave birth to babies with microcephaly, right? So let us write what are the fetal manifestations of Zika virus. The fetal manifestations of Zika virus, number 1, it decreases the brain matter. Number 2, and the size of the brain is decreased. It brings about cortical atrophy. Now, because the size of the brain is decreased, so there will be microcephaly, which is one of the most common presenting features of congenital Zika virus syndrome. Number 4, because the cortex is going to atrophy, there will be compensatory ventriculomegaly. Number 5, it leads to ocular symptoms as well, like they can be macular scarring. Number 6, there is increased tone of the limbs. So once these babies are born, they have increased tone, hypertonia, and they have congenital contractures, congenital limb contractions. For example, clubfoot. Right? So these are all manifestations which are seen with Zika virus. Right? Now, a few more important points which I want you to write about Zika virus is, Zika virus is the first mosquito-borne teratogen. Sexual transmission of Zika virus is also possible. And fetal infection, how do we come to know that the fetus is infected? You will have to do a PCR of the amniotic fluid, right? So, a question on Zika virus in pregnancy came this time. It could be that next time you are getting a question on COVID-19 in pregnancy. For COVID-19 in pregnancy, I want you to watch my video on COVID-19 infection in pregnancy on my YouTube channel, Dr. Sakshi Arora Hans, Obs and Gynae. Right? Everything what you need to know about COVID-19 infection in pregnancy, I have told you there. So now you can understand that when this image was given to you, which was showing keratinocytes, which was showing dendritic cells, Hofbauer cells, and it was showing the receptors. I think, some of the students are saying that the receptors were shown there, AXL receptor was marked there, and the question was saying that there is microcephaly. So the answer had to be Zika virus, right? Let's go to the next question. Next question was modified Robson's classification group 1 includes. Now, this is one question which none of you would have studied, right? No one would have read this question and no one would be knowing. Most of you, I don't think so any student would be knowing modified Robson's classification, or this was taught in any of the institutes. I will be very honest, I did not teach it anywhere in my video lectures. Right? Now, I believe this question was put to test your smartness. Now, you could be smart in two ways. Either you could be smart in leaving this question and, preventing yourself from getting a negative marking. Or you could be smart enough to understand that they are asking you group 1. Now, group 1 of any disease, group 1 of any classification, group 1 anywhere would always mean the most basic thing, right? And if you look at the options, in the options, if I ask you between nulliparous female and multiparous female, which category of female would you like to put as group 1? In any classification, group 1 would mean the most basic, right? So the most basic would be when she gets pregnant for the first time, right? So between option A, B, C and D, option A and B had nulliparous in the options. Option C and D had multiparous. So I wouldn't have marked option C and D anyways. This is I am telling you a way how to make a smart guess. Just in case you had to mark an answer to this question, then how would you have marked it smartly? All of you must be watching KBC. Sometimes or the other, you must have watched KBC. And Amitabh Bachchan has this typical habit. If you say, I'm quitting, he will say, no, please tell me the answer to this question so that I want to see whether you would have answered it correctly or not in case you would have attempted it. So I am also telling you that I don't want you to mark answers, if you don't know anything, I don't want you to mark an answer in that question. But just in case you have to make a smart guess, then what would that be? So nulliparous female, then Next was single pregnancy in option B, A and B, that's common. Then cephalic presentation, that's common in option A and B. Induced labor and spontaneous labor. Now tell me, spontaneous labor is something which would come as a low risk thing and would be coming in group 1, or induced labor would be coming in group 1? Common sense tells me that spontaneous labor should come in group 1, right? So an intelligent guess to this question would have been nulliparous single cephalic spontaneous labor, right? Now let's talk about this classification in detail. So Robson's classification, it was proposed by WHO in 2015, and that is also called as the 10-point classification. Now this classification, it is used by various institutes in order to compare the rates of cesarean sections and the indications of cesarean sections. So it's a global standard and it's used by various institutes to know why the cesarean section was done and to compare the percentages of the cesarean sections what are being done. Now, WHO in this classification has used 5 parameters. The first parameter is the parity, whether the cesarean section was done in a primigravida female or a multigravida female or a multigravida female with previous cesarean section, right? Number 2, the gestational age, whether the cesarean section was done at term or whether it was done in preterm patients. Number 3, it was about the number of fetuses, whether you are doing cesarean section in a single fetus or you are doing it in a multifetal pregnancy. Number 4, whether you are doing it for spontaneous labor or whether you are doing it after inducing labor, right? Number 5, whether you are doing cesarean section in cephalic presentation or whether you are doing it in any mal presentation. So based on this criteria, there are 10 classes which are formed, 10 groups which are formed, right? So group 1 and group 2, they include nulliparous females with a single fetus at term. So mark this term at term, make a circle around it, cephalic presentation. Right, so in group 1 and group 2, we have nulliparous females with single fetuses at term with cephalic presentation. In group 1, it is spontaneous labor. So if cesarean was done in a nulliparous female with single fetus at term with cephalic presentation with spontaneous labor, and group 2 includes induced labor. Right? Similarly, group 3 and group 4, they include multiparous females. Now, multiparous females could be females with previous history of cesarean section or without previous history of cesarean section. So here we are including multiparous without previous history of cesarean section. Again, the same thing. Single term cephalic. 3 includes spontaneous labor. 4 includes induced labor. So I hope you are understanding this. So it is just telling you whether the cesarean section was done in group 3 patient or a group 4 patient. So if I say cesarean section was done in a group 3 patient, what does that mean? Cesarean section done in a group 3 patient means that she is a multiparous female without any history of previous cesarean section. Her pregnancy is at term. She has a single fetus in cephalic presentation. She had spontaneous labor and then cesarean section was done in her. Right? Then group 5. Group 5 is multiparous with previous history of cesarean section. After that, anything. If she has a previous history of cesarean section, she comes in group 5, right? Group 6 is primi with breech. Group 7 is multi with breech. It's easy till here. 8, 9 and 10 you can remember by the mnemonic MTP. Multifetal pregnancy. So if cesarean section is done in multifetal pregnancy, whether she is primi or whether she is multi, hardly matters. We are going to put her in group 8. T stands for transverse lie or oblique lie. So if cesarean is done in transverse lie or oblique lie. P stands for preterm pregnancy. Right? So these are the 10 groups which are called as the 10 Robson's. It is called as the Robson's classification or the 10-point classification, right? Now let us go back to our question. Our question was saying modified Robson's classification group 1 includes. So what was group 1 including? Group 1 was including nulliparous females, single pregnancy, cephalic and spontaneous labor. Induced labor was group 2. Multiparous without previous cesarean section spontaneous labor was group 3. Multiparous without previous cesarean section induced cesarean section before labor is group 4. And if they would have said multiparous with previous cesarean section, she would have been group 5. Clear to all of you? Okay, next question is, a pregnant female has cramps in her legs. What will you suggest to relieve the pain? Now tell me, why do cramps occur? See, cramps, they occur in a non-pregnant or in all of us if we are sitting for a very long time, so if you have been non-active or if you have been in one position for a very long time, that leads to cramps. Right? And in case of pregnant females, cramps are much more common. Why are they very common in pregnant females? In a pregnant female, cramps are common because of number 1, decreased calcium, number 2, decreased magnesium, and number 3, because of the deposition of lactic acid. All these 3 factors, they lead to increased muscle cramps in pregnant female. Right? These cramps, they are more common at night. They are more common after, rather I should say they are more common in the second half of pregnancy. And they are more common in lower limbs. Now, when cramps occur, what happens is that the muscle, it gets contracted and there is a lot of pain. So any group of muscles, most commonly it's the calf muscles which will contract, and it is going to lead to a lot of pain. And with this kind of, with muscle cramps, there is plantar flexion of the foot. So whenever cramps happen, there is muscle contraction plus there is plantar flexion. So now tell me, you are lying down on your bed and you have muscle cramp at night. What do? You stretch your leg, and because there is plantar flexion, you tend to dorsiflex your foot, right? And that is what we advise a pregnant female also to do. We tell her to extend her knee and to dorsiflex the foot, because automatically when the cramp is happening, plantar flexion is happening. Right? So I am going to tell her that extend your feet and to dorsiflex, extend your knee and to dorsiflex your foot. That is going to relieve your muscle cramp. Apart from that, I can also give her certain other advices, non-medical advices, like I can tell her that every day, she should be a little more active in the daytime. Before going to bed, she can take a hot shower. Whenever she has muscle cramps, apart from doing extension of knee and dorsiflexion of foot, she can give a little bit of massage to her calf muscles with, hot oil. And we can advise her to take magnesium, because these cramps are happening because of decreased magnesium. So we can advise her to take magnesium as well. So this is how muscle cramps are treated during pregnancy. They are not, something which is very pathological. They are physiological during pregnancy. And yes, they are painful. So we will have to give these advices to the female so that her pain is relieved, right? Do you know one fun fact about these muscle cramps? These muscle cramps are called as Charlie's horse. Charlie's horse. I also didn't know this, that they are called as Charlie's horse. When I was looking through muscle cramps in a few books, I got to know this and I thought I'll share this with you. So here I have an image for you where the muscle cramp is being relieved in pregnancy with dorsiflexion of the foot and extension of the knee, right? So the next question is, a lady presented for vaginal breech delivery. Which among the following is false? Option A, breech identified for the first time during delivery is a contraindication for normal delivery. Now, tell me, if breach is identified for the first time during delivery, is it a contraindication for normal delivery? No. You are going to conduct assisted breech delivery if the patient is coming to you and she's already 4 centimeters or 5 centimeters dilated. You are going to go, proceed with the breech deliveries. Rather, most of the vaginal breech deliveries which we do it because they come to us in labor, right? If, in planned cases, in all those females who we detect breech in the antenatal period, most of the times in institutions, they are taken up for cesarean section. But most of the cases who deliver vaginally are those cases who come to you when they are in labor, right? So option A is incorrect. Breech delivery is done only in a hospital where a facility for emergency cesarean section is available, and that's true, right? Because in breech deliveries, there are much more complications than compared to a normal vaginal delivery. So whenever you are conducting breech delivery, you have to be very careful. It's a high risk pregnancy and you are doing a procedure which is much more riskier than a normal vaginal delivery. So you have to be sure that the senior consultant is available there. Number 2, you have to do continuous fetal monitoring. Why? Because if at any point of time there is fetal distress, you can immediately take her up for cesarean section. And you are going to see to it that facility for emergency cesarean section is always available. In breech deliveries, there are a lot of complications which are not seen in a normal vaginal delivery. In a normal vaginal delivery, it is the head of the baby which comes out first, right? But in breech delivery, head is the last part to deliver. So many times it happens that the head of the baby gets stuck. And that is the time when you need the expertise of a senior, right? So whenever you are conducting breech deliveries, make sure that the senior consultant is available there, right? So option B, breech delivery is done only in hospital setting where emergency cesarean is available is correct. Continuous fetal heart rate monitoring is required. That's correct. It should be performed only with the help of an experienced senior obstetrician. That's also correct, right? So the incorrect option here was option A, and I think that was a very easy question. All of you would have got this question correct. Recombinant HPV vaccine is made from. Now, this question, I could answer this question in a single line. But I want you to understand some concepts and then answer this question. So, if this over here is the HPV DNA, the HPV human papilloma virus. Now, in this virus, there are proteins which are called as the capsid proteins, right? Now, these what I am drawing in orange, they are the capsid L1 proteins. And then we have the capsid L2 protein. Now, whenever human HPV virus infection happens, first step is that it has to get attached to the epithelial cell. Now, for attachment of the epithelial cell, it is these capsid proteins which help. Right? So, L1, L2 proteins, they help in the attachment to the epithelial cells. Number 1. Now, common sense tells me that if I have to prepare vaccines which are there to prevent HPV infection, I should target these L1, L2 proteins. Right? When the attachment will not be there, obviously infection will not be there. And because L1 is more than L2, so common sense also tells me this, that I should be targeting L1 capsid protein, right? Now, once the virus gets entry into the epithelial cell, the second step, what happens is viral replication. Now, for viral replication, the proteins which are needed are E1 and E2, right? Then the third step which happens is that the viral genome, it integrates into the host DNA, right? Now the viral genome is going to integrate into the host DNA and it is going to lead to malignant transformation. And for malignant transformation, the proteins which are required are E6 and E7. Right? E6 is the protein which knocks out P53. This P53 is a tumor suppressor gene. So E6 is going to knock out P53 gene, whereas E7 is going to knock out the retinoblastoma gene. Both of these are tumor suppressor genes, right? Now, when E6 is going to suppress the P53 suppressor gene, that makes the virus immortal. So the moment this step is done, virus becomes immortal. And when E7 knocks out retinoblastoma gene, that is the final step in malignant transformation. So the final step of malignant transformation is when E6 knocks out retinoblastoma gene. So this is how the HPV cycle is. Now, just now I told you that if I want to make vaccines, I should be targeting the L1 capsid protein. Now the good part is what happened is we saw that this capsid L1 protein, it has the ability to self-assemble itself into virus-like particles. So many capsid L1 proteins, they make an assembly and they form a virus-like particle. But this virus-like particle, which is called as the VLP, it doesn't have the viral DNA, right? Now, because they do not have viral DNA, they are empty. That is why they are non-infective and they are non-oncogenic. Neither can they lead to any infection, neither can they lead to cancers. But when this virus-like protein will be introduced into the host cell will perceive it as if there is a viral infection, HPV infection, and its immune system will work to form antibodies against these VLPs. So all the, the vaccines which are available in the market, they are made from these VLPs, and these VLPs are made up of capsid L1 protein. And that is what question has been asked. They have asked you recombinant HPV vaccine is made up of L1. So remember, all vaccines are recombinant vaccines and they are made up of VLPs. VLPs are made up of L1, right? We have identified VLPs of 10 subtypes of HPV. And what are the 10 subtypes of HPV whose VLPs have been made? HPV 6, 11, 16, 18, 31, 33, 45, 52, 58. Now this makes it 9. The 9 available are used in the Gardasil nonavalent vaccine. Or if you are using only VLP 6 and 11 and 16 and 18, if you are using 6, 11, 16, 18 VLPs, you are making Gardasil vaccine. If you are using only VLP 16 and 18, you are making Cerverax vaccine. If you are using these 9, you are making Gardasil 9 vaccine. Now one more has been identified which is not yet used in vaccines, and that is VLP 39. Right? Next question. A 45-year-old female patient with repeated infections of Trichomonas vaginitis is advised for pap smear by her gynecologist. She questions you, the intern, regarding the purpose of this test. What would your response be? So option given was it's a screening test for cervical cancer, it's a diagnostic test for Trichomonas infection, it helps to diagnose cancer in her genital tract, and it helps to diagnose other associated genital infections in her. Now tell me, if you have a female who's come to you with profuse frothy discharge, which is yellowish in color, right? You are suspecting Trichomonas infection, and if you are suspecting Trichomonas infection, you do a pervaginal examination. You see that yes, there is strawberry vagina, right? There is red, angry looking vagina, and you say that yes, my patient is having Trichomonas infection. What is the investigation of choice which you do? The investigation of choice which you do in a Trichomonas infection is wet mount microscopy. And once you see something moving under microscope, that means you are looking at the Trichomonas, then you know that I have to do the diagnostic test, and the diagnostic test which is done these days is the NAT test. If NAT test is not available, you go for culture. Now, is there any role of doing pap smear in a Trichomonas infection? No, right? If in pap smear, you may get to see Trichomonas infection as an incidental finding. But if you are suspecting Trichomonas, are you going to order for a pap smear? No. right? So this option over here, that it is a diagnostic test for Trichomonas infection, that's incorrect. Similarly, it's a diagnostic test for other genital infections, that's also wrong, right? In Pap smear, I agree that yes, you can identify a few infections. But then Pap smear is not the test which I would advise if these infections are happening, right? Now, so why did we order a Pap smear? So answer is very simple. We ordered a Pap smear because I wanted to do screening for cancer cervix. Now, against this background, what is the relevance? Why did you give this? Why did they give you this background and then they asked you this question? That is because, see, Trichomonas is a sexually transmitted disease, right? And most of the times, Trichomonas infection is not a recurrent infection if you have treated your patient with metronidazole and the patient's partner with metronidazole. Now, if patient is having recurrent Trichomonas infections, that means, number one, she is having other sexually transmitted diseases as well, maybe, right? Number two, she may be having multiple sex partners. That is why she is having recurrent Trichomonas infections. And in either of the cases, whether she is having associated other sexually transmitted diseases or whether she has she has multiple sex partners, in both these cases, I would be thinking about screening her for cancer cervix. Why? Because human papilloma virus is also a sexually transmitted disease. So in repeated Trichomonas infections, you should be very careful because it could be that that female is having other sexually transmitted diseases also, like she could be having HPV, she could be having other STDs, or she could be having HIV also, right? And that is why we did Pap smear to screen her for cancer cervix. Clear to all of you? Okay. Now, since this question has come, let me ask you, on Pap smear, how do you identify Trichomonas infections? Now, since this question has been asked, let me ask you one question. How do you identify Trichomonas infection on a Pap smear? So this over here is a Pap smear image. And if I make this arrow and I ask you, identify which organism are you seeing? And this is how they're going to ask you the question. This is precisely the way they're going to ask you. They're going to show you an image-based question and they're going to ask you, identify the organism. Now, always remember a few rules regarding it. If the size of the organism is equal to the size of the nucleus of the epithelial cells, then it is Trichomonas. So these are certain tips which you are going to remember. If the size of the organism is less than the size of the nucleus of the epithelial cells, then that is Candida, right? If you are getting clue cells, so what are clue cells? Epithelial cells to which the bacteria are adhered, then you are dealing with bacterial vaginosis. If you are seeing that the size of the organism, now I am not talking about the nucleus, I am talking about the size of the epithelial cells. If the size of the organism is more than the size of the epithelial cell, right? It's not the nucleus, it is more than the cell itself. Then you are dealing with actinomyces infection, right? So over here in this image, what you are seeing the size of the organism and the size of the nuclei is roughly the same, right? Now, in this image, what you are seeing, this is the size of the nucleus, and this yellow colored, between this yellow colored is a dot made. And this yellow colored they have made, and they have asked you that identify the organism. That dot, small little dot, you have to see inside that yellow circles which are made there. Now these dots which are made, they are smaller than the epithelial cells nuclei. And if the organism is smaller than the nuclei of epithelial cells, that means you are dealing with Candida. Now in Candida, you can get an image like this, or you can get an image like this. In this image, what you are seeing? In this image, you are seeing that there was a hyphae actually of the Candida, to this hyphae, the epithelial cells, they are sticking, right? And this is what is called as a Shami kebab appearance. Shami kebab appearance. So I have an image of Shami kebab in front of you, and you can see this organism over here is looking like the Shami kebab, right? So this is the Shami kebab appearance, and this Shami kebab appearance is also seen in Candida, right? Then over here in this pap smear image, what you are seeing, in this pap smear image, I am seeing that the epithelial cell is studded with bacteria. The bacteria, they are, stuck onto the epithelial cell, and this is what is called as clue cell, and clue cell is diagnostic for bacterial vaginosis, right? Next image. In this image, what you are seeing? In this image, you are seeing this over here is the size of the epithelial cell. And this blue colored over here is the organism. So this blue colored organism is much larger than the epithelial cell itself. So it is actinomyces. Right? That's the most common PID which you get in IUCD users. Actinomyces. Right? So this is how you're going to identify organisms on pap smear. Although this was not asked, but I thought I'll let you know just in case in future you are asked this question. Coming to the last question of INI-CT, and that is a midwife is examining, and I should say this is the most tricky question. A midwife is examining a pregnant woman in labor when she noticed cord prolapse. What is the next immediate step of management that she should do? Option A, gently replace the cord inside the vagina. Option B, put her in Trendelenburg position. Option C, inform the doctor and shift to OT. Option D, do vaginal examination and find the fetal presentation. Okay. Now, I am not going to tell you what I think about the answer. We are going to read some guidelines, and I'm going to show you the guidelines of Royal College of Obstetrician and Gynae, and that is the Green Top guidelines. Now, according to Green Top guidelines, number one, there are insufficient data to evaluate manual replacement of the prolapsed cord above the presenting part to allow continuation of labor. This practice is not recommended. So, once you see a cord prolapse, you should never be tempted to put it back into its normal position and continue with labor. That is something which should not be done, right? Number two, to prevent vasospasm, there should be minimal handling of the loops of cord lying outside the vagina. See, if I ask you what is the problem with cord prolapse it leads to two problems. Number one, there can be cord compression. And why would there be cord compression? Because the presenting part is going to press on the cord. Now, because the presenting part is going to press on the cord, that can lead to cord compression. And because the cord would get compressed, it would lead to hypoxia in the fetus, or it could lead to fetal death. And that is why cord prolapse is an emergency which should be managed quickly, right? Number two, the second problem which could happen is that because the cord is getting exposed to the external environment, there is vasospasm. And again, this vasospasm can lead to hypoxia. So because of cord compression, there can be hypoxia, or because of vasospasm, there can be hypoxia. Right? And this vasospasm would further get aggravated if you touch the cord. Right? That is why whenever there is a cord prolapse, you shouldn't get tempted to touch the cord and put it back in vagina. Right? So you are not going to put it back above the presenting part, but you are not also going to hold it and put it back in vagina. That is also not done. If you have to put the cord in vagina, you are going to take a gauze piece, you are going to take a sponge holding forceps, and gently you are going to push it back into the vagina with the help of that gauze piece. Right? So option A, which they have given you over here, is gently replace the cord inside the vagina. That's correct, right? Now, next is to prevent cord compression, it is recommended that the presenting part should be elevated either manually or by filling the bladder. So, in order to prevent compression from happening, what we say is that you lift the presenting part up with your one hand. So, one of the assistants will be asked to go and just, do a pervaginal examination and with one hand lift the presenting part up. And now, the assistant's hand would remain in the vagina while I am shifting the patient to OT, while I am doing cesarean section and taking out the baby. Unless and until I take out the baby, till that time the hand would be in vagina only, so that the presenting part doesn't compress onto the cord. The other way could be that I fill the bladder. Bladder is filled with 500 to 750 ml of normal saline with the help of Foley's catheter, and when the bladder would be distended, it would automatically push the presenting part up. Now, cord compression can further be reduced by mother adopting the knee chest position or the left lateral position, preferably with head down. Now, when you do head down, that is what is called as the Trendelenburg position, and pillow under the left hip. Right? Tocolysis can be considered. And what is the mode of delivery? Mode of delivery is cesarean section unless and until vaginal delivery is about to happen. So if vaginal delivery is imminent, I'll go for vaginal delivery. But if I see that no, vaginal delivery is not imminent, then I'm going to take up the patient for cesarean section. Right? Now your question is saying, a midwife had seen and she had noticed cord prolapse. What is the next immediate step? Gently replace the cord inside the vagina or to put her in Trendelenburg position. Now tell me, you are standing there and you are seeing that the cord has prolapsed. The first instinct should be that put the patient in Trendelenburg position. Then go and wear gloves. Take a sponge holding forceps and gently replace the cord inside the vagina, right? And as it is, the question specifically mentioned a midwife is doing this. So when a midwife is seeing cord prolapse, first thing what as a midwife I would do 100%, I'm going to put the patient in Trendelenburg position, and then I would think about handling the cord gently. Because if I handle the cord with my hands, it would lead to vasospasm, and that would lead to further hypoxia in the fetus, right? So the first instinct should always be to put the patient in Trendelenburg position, right? Okay, so my bet for this answer is Trendelenburg position. I know you will get people who will say that the answer is gently place the cord inside the vagina. Neither are they wrong, neither am I wrong. We don't know what the examiner wants for this answer, for this question. This is a tricky question where the answer could be option A, it could be option B. What I am telling you, I am supplementing it with the guidelines. The guidelines are saying that you have to minimally handle the cord. And since over here, they haven't told us that how they are going to replace the cord inside the vagina. I don't know that whether they are replacing the cord inside the vagina with their own hands or they are applying the correct technique to do it. So as far as option A is concerned, I'm putting it in plus minus. I know 100% Trendelenburg position should be done, right? So I'm taking option B as the answer. Now, since I had to, again supplement my answer with few more texts. So I looked up in a few more books and I read in J.B. Sharma's textbook of obstetrics. In J.B. Sharma's textbook of obstetrics, again, what Dr. J.B. Sharma has said is that the first step should be to relieve the pressure on the umbilical cord. Right? And in order to relieve pressure on the umbilical cord, you are going to put the patient in Trendelenburg position. And further, because it was a midwife was mentioned there, so I looked up in International Book of Midwifery, which is Miles' textbook of midwifery, and this is what I got there. A nurse who sees an umbilical cord prolapsed outside the birth canal should place the patient in Trendelenburg position. This causes gravity to shift the fetus upward into uterine cavity away from the prolapsed cord, allowing pressure to be relieved. Further, it says a nurse who finds a prolapsed cord during sterile vaginal examination, they should use the examining fingers to apply counter pressure to the infant's presenting part, relieving pressure on the umbilical cord. This counter pressure cannot be released until the infant is completely delivered from uterine cavity by cesarean section. Right? So I am giving you the answer as Trendelenburg position here. Clear to all of you? A few more details about cord prolapse. So there are two terms, cord prolapse and cord presentation. Cord presentation is when the cord lies alongside or below the presenting part with the membranes still intact. So if the cord is below or besides the presenting part and the membranes are still intact, that is called as cord presentation. And during vaginal examination, if you find that there is cord presentation, the management is cesarean section, right? Cord prolapse, it means that the membranes are ruptured and now either the cord is lying alongside the presenting part. If cord is lying alongside the presenting part, that is called as occult cord prolapse, or it could be that the cord has descended and now it is lying in vagina. Now, if cord has descended and it is lying in vagina, that is called as a overt cord prolapse or a frank cord prolapse, right? Management of cord prolapse should always be, you have to go for immediate delivery. Most common cause of cord prolapse, that is malpresentation, and in malpresentation it is transverse lie followed by foot link followed by knee presentation. Other than that, twin pregnancy, prematurity and cephalopelvic disproportion can also lead to cord prolapse. So always when the membranes rupture and the head of the fetus was not fixed, you should always, do a per vaginal examination to rule out cord prolapse. That should be a number one rule. Number two, if head of the baby is not fixed, you shouldn't do an artificial rupture of membranes. And number three, in all these high-risk pregnancies, if the patient is in labor, you have to do a continuous fetal heart rate monitoring. And the fetal heart rate finding, which tells you that cord prolapse has happened, is variable deceleration. So if on CTG you are getting variable deceleration, that means either the cord is getting compressed or cord prolapse has happened, right? So this is all what I wanted to tell you about the questions which had come. But this is not the end of the discussion, because I want to talk to you about this news that yes, the NEET exam has got postponed. Now, this NEET exam getting postponed, I am reading all over the social media that some of the students are very happy that the exam has got postponed, and some of you are feeling that this is a roadblock, right? Now, if I would have been in your place, I would have been very happy with this news that the exam has got postponed. Why I would have been happy? Because either I would have been in that category of students who started preparing late. Now, all those students all of you who have started preparing late, this is a big opportunity for you to come back into the race. Now is the time that you can also win this race. What you have to do is just work hard, and you turtles can win this race by working hard. These 3 months are something where you are going to complete all the subjects which you were not able to complete in the past so many months. You are going to complete all the Q-Banks all the Q-Bank modules which you were not able to complete, and you are going to give grand tests, right? When you do this much, then definitely you are back into the race, right? And you can even win this race with these 3 months in hand. But if I would have been in the other category of students, those students who started preparing early and by September, October, their revision was complete, and by the month of November, December, the second revision was complete, then also I would have been very happy. Why? Because now I would have got a chance to compete not only for NEET PG, I would have also appeared for the mid-year INI CET exam. If I am a very bright student who's thinking of getting a good rank in NEET PG, the moment I would have got a good rank in NEET PG, I wouldn't have given INI CET mid-year exam, right? So take this as an opportunity to appear for both these exams. Maybe that is what luck wants. That is what God wants. God wants you to be, having a PG degree from the central institutes and not from any other institute. So it is a win-win situation for all of you. These 3 months are going to be a boon for all of you. Now it is only up to you. These 3 months, how you are going to utilize. I am not worried about those students who did not complete their revisions till now. I know they know what to do. They know how they have to study, what subjects they have to study. I'm a little worried about this second category of students who have completed their, syllabus and who were on track. And with this news coming in, they are feeling as if now their tempo is going low. No. That is something which you don't have to do. You have to maintain your momentum. You have to study with the same pace as you were doing till now. You are the hares of the story and you are not going to let the turtles win. You are going to bring a new and a fresh end to the story. And in this fresh end, you are not going to sleep in the mid of the race. You are going to fight daily and now I'm going to see a tough fight between the turtles and between the hares. Turtles, you have to work hard, and hares, you don't have to let the turtles win. That is the kind of spirit which I want all of you to have in these 3 months. So these 3 months, at the outset, it appears as if, oh my God, there are 3 months left. But if you actually see, there are just 3 months left. You have 19 subjects, bachcho. Right? And if you are taking around 3 days for each subject, hardly that means you are going to get in 60 days, you are going to complete just 1 revision. And then you will have hardly 1 month left. So don't take it that I have got 3 months left. Believe me, every day the competition is increasing. Day by day, more conceptual questions are being asked. Day by day, they are asking you more clinical questions. And in April, when you have, that is the proposed date, in April, when you have the, NEET exam, I am sure they are going to ask you many conceptual questions, many clinical questions. And after the exam, many of you are going to come and say that, ma'am, we were confused in 2 options. The 2 options we could rule out, but there was confusion between 2 options what to mark. And when you have confusion between 2 options, that is because of 2 reasons. Number 1, because you haven't revised well. And number 2, because you have not built up your concepts. So this 3 months, you are going to, utilize for both these things. You are going to revise well and you are going to build your concepts so that at the end, when the exam happens, you are not giving excuses to your family that why you couldn't score well. Rather, you are sitting here where I am sitting and you are sharing your success stories with all of us. That is what I want from all of you, right? Now, one another thing. If you haven't completed any subject, then obviously your strategy would be to complete that subject, to do the question banks and to attempt as many GTs as possible. So when I say as many GTs as possible, at least 1 GT a week you should be attempting. Now, if you have completed your 2 revisions, now how to go about? Now, if you have completed 2 revisions, what I want you to do is first stop thinking that the exam has been postponed. Think that the exam is still on the 10th of January. Now, if you keep on feeding this to your mind that the exam is on the 10th of January and it has not been postponed, you are going to work with the same zeal. And how is your day going to look like? Your day should look like that you have to put in at least 10 to 12 hours of study. And this 10 to 12 hours of study is not what includes question bank. This 10 to 12 hours of study is the core study which you are going to do. Now, if you ask me what plan I have for you, if I would have been in your place, I would have thought that till 10th of January, I have got 2 months. right? And every day I would have got up at 5 o'clock in the morning until 5 in the evening. I have 12 hours. Out of those 12 hours, suppose, 2 hours, they just go waste. You are relaxing after every 1 hour of study or 1.5 hours of study, you relax for 15 minutes. You have your breakfast, you have your lunch. So basically you have from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m., you have only 10 hours in your hands, right? Now this 10 hour, I wouldn't have done this, that I'm going to study just one subject. So this approach that I have to complete Obs and Gynae in 3 days, I have to complete surgery in 4 days, I wouldn't have adopted now. Now my approach would have been that I am going to take 8 subjects per day, right, for a month, right? Now, when I take 8 subjects, that 8 subjects could be any of the subjects in which you are weak. Preferably, it should be subjects of first prof and second prof, right? Now, 1 hour or 1.5 hours you are going to give to each subject starting from 5 o'clock in the morning. So, set small targets. Do not say that I have to complete anatomy in 3 days. Now, because you have done anatomy, so twice. Now, if you have to complete it in 3 days, unnecessarily you would be wasting your time. Right? Now say that I have to study anatomy for 1 hour. That's a short goal which you have taken. And in that 1 hour, give your full attention to whatever topic you are reading from anatomy. After 1.5 hours, switch from anatomy, go to physiology. Then after physiology, go to pharmacology for 1 hour. This you should do from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the evening. Right? Choose any 8 subjects, study those 8 subjects for 1 to 1.5 hours and make it a target that till 10th of January, you are going to study these 8 subjects daily, 1 hour each. Right? Now, after 5 o'clock, now from 5 in the morning to 5 in the evening, I don't want you to lift up your mobile phones at all. Right? Just put them away somewhere. After 5 o'clock, now is your time. Look at your mobiles. Do whatever you want to do on the social media. Check whatever posts you want to check. And then sit again. Now sit and solve all the MCQs. Just solve MCQs after 7 o'clock. From 7 o'clock to 10 or 10:30. That is the time when you are going to solve MCQs only. And then sleep, get up again at 5 o'clock. Now, if you do this way, you won't even know that you are putting at least 12 to 13 hours of good work, smart work. You are not wasting your time. You are utilizing 12 to 13 hours of your day. And that is what is important, right? Last 3 months are the most crucial months for any exam preparation. Right? This is the time which shouldn't be wasted at all. But you are, contesting around, you are contesting against around 1.2 lakh students. Right? 1.2 to 1.5 lakh students are going to appear for this NEET PG exam. And if you are thinking that you want to get a rank within 10,000, then you have to put in that extra effort. These rest of the students, they are not ordinary students. They are students who are like you, who are also working hard and who are as intelligent as you are. And with this 3 to 4 months, they also have the capability to come in top 10,000 students. So if you want to be in that top 10,000 students, you will have to do something extra. Every day you will have to push yourself harder. As far as the months of March, Feb and March are concerned, everyone will be working hard in Feb and March. But it is this December, January which is going to decide what your rank is going to look like. Whether you are going to be in top hundreds or whether you are going to be in top thousands, that is what is going to be decided by this December, January months. And that is why I am telling you that in this December, January month, you are not going to sit back and relax. you are going to put at least 12 to 13 hours of study and follow the way what I told you. Maybe my way doesn't suit you, but find out another way which suits you, where you are giving yourself short targets, small targets not of 3 hours, 4 hours, but targets of 1 hour, right? The other thing is, during weekends, I want all of you to appear only for grand tests. Weekends should be reserved for grand tests. And when I say you have to appear for grand tests, I want you to diversify your source of grand tests. You shouldn't diversify your source of study at this point of time. Your notes should be the ones which you have to refer to. But when it comes to grand tests, I want you to diversify the source of grand tests. See, let me explain you this with an example. When there was the AIIMS exam separate, PGI separate, JIPMER separate, we all knew that there are few, topics which are favorite of this institute, of AIIMS institute, few topics which are, say, favorite of JIPMER, few topics which are favorite of PGI. So every institute have their own pattern, own style, and own favorite topics. Similarly, every coaching institute also has their own pattern. Every platform which is giving you grand test has its own pattern. A few people would be giving grand tests which are very difficult. A few would be giving intermediate kind of grand tests. A few would be giving simple. Right? And you should be in a habit of solving each and every variety of grand test. And that is why I am asking you to diversify your source of grand test at this point of time. If you have subscribed to, for example, Marrow, then simultaneously subscribe for some other grand test also. Or if you have subscribed to some other grand test, then please come and subscribe to Marrow's grand test. This is going to, add more questions. It is going to add more variety of questions to your preparation. And it is also going to tell you where you are standing amongst different groups of people. So amongst Marrow subscribers, what is your rank? Amongst, suppose you have subscribed to any coaching. So amongst the coaching subscribers, what is your rank? And that is what is going to give you a competition. So you have to compete amongst different categories of student and then evaluate where you are standing. And from there, you have to see that you have to do better, right? So, I hope my little tips are going to help you, and I hope all of you are going to utilize these 3 months in a very, very intelligent manner. And I really want to see a tough fight going on between the turtles and the hares. Take care, keep studying. All the best.